Alrighty then. Uh, Today I want to talk about aesthetics. Now, what is aesthetics exactly? Sometimes we think of aesthetics in terms of looking at pictures of art, and aesthetics is closely related to something we call the philosophy of art, which is more generally asking basic philosophical questions about art objects and art practices and so on. But aesthetics, as I'm talking about today, is something a lot more basic than that. Sometimes when we're talking about consciousness, something I like to ask you, and I've asked you once or twice in some of the other videos, is to sort of focus your attention on the way your feet feel. Maybe they're barefoot and on the floor. Maybe they're in some shoes. Maybe how do they feel in the shoes that they're in? Um, sort of conscious experience. Now, aesthetics is just completely sinuous with that. The question is, how does that feel to you? Does that feel good or does that feel bad? So in general, what we're talking about here is value theory. And let me just get on to then the slide here. Of course, this very arresting picture of this beautiful baby. Um, so, more generally, as conscious beings who have conscious experiences, our experiences have these qualities of being good or bad. Good or bad. I'm leaving that deliberately vague. The vagueness in the phrase goodness and badness is intentional because we want to leave our minds open as to what goodness and badness are exactly. Um, Ultimately, my view is going to be some fairly basic kind of view about goodness and badness being some kind of phenomenal experiences. But the question is, there's going to be a lot of different things we think of as good or bad. And if we're talking about value theory, another thing then is that aesthetics and ethics really are sort of the same thing, depending on various views. Let's get on with it. The goodness and badness of life is what we're talking about here. So, what is it? The broadest sense, then again, there are some things that feel good to us, some things that feel bad. We think we're indifferent to a lot of sensory experiences, but ultimately, I think we're probably not really indifferent to them, as some are more important to others. And there are various philosophical theories about what goodness and badness are. So, second bullet point there, as I said, it looks to me like value theory. The value theory, right? So, value theory, why is that a philosophical topic? Because value statements refer to something called values and sometimes properties, various kinds of properties we're going to talk about. And then people also make claims about knowing that things are good and bad. So, it looks as if aesthetics is value theory is about the goodness and badness of things. Well, is the goodness and badness of things a physical quality of things? And of course, a lot of philosophers are going to tell you no. I'm going to interrogate that a little bit. And then the other question is, well, how do we make these kinds of aesthetic judgments and how do we make ethical judgments if they're not like scientific judgments or empirical judgments about matters of fact? That is, aesthetics is epistemologically interesting. So, so that's the level of we're going to talk about. As I say, third bullet point. In philosophy of art, we might ask, that's specifically about the institutions of art and the practice of art. And we might ask there sort of what makes objects that we think of as art objects, what defines the extension of that set, right? What are all and only art objects in some sort of physical terms? You have obviously institutional constructivist theories of art, other kinds of theories of art. So art itself as a human convention, we have this convention or this concept that we call art. And so that's philosophically interesting. So there is a whole topic called philosophy of art. It's very, very interesting and very important. Aesthetics is a much broader topic. Aesthetics is almost, you can think of as a psychological topic. A physiologist could study aesthetics easily in terms of looking at the kinds of reactions to people and talking about the goodness and the badness of the reactions. I'm going to be talking, as I usually am on these videos, which are just really meant to be really basic and really introductory. And so I'm going to be talking about just canonical approaches to ethics, the ancient Greek approach, and then the approaches of the empiricists and the rationalists of the early modern period, respectively. Not because these are the only or the most important takes on these questions, but because if we are students of philosophy and the humanities, then this is where we want to start. Okay, why? Because it's a canonical tradition. It's a body of literature. It's a collective product. Yeah, it doesn't mean it's the be all and the end all or anything it says is right. I'm not an authoritarian type myself. All right, let's talk about the Greeks. Now, the Greeks have a whole different approach to value than modern people do. They are virtue theorists, and people are going to be mostly familiar with this more from ethical theory, I think, than from aesthetics, of course. That is, the ancient Greeks thought that what you were judging when you made a judgment was the whole person, not just the action, not just the intention, as various respective modern theories of ethics might have it, but rather whether or not this was a good example of a virtuous person. And the Greeks took the aim of philosophy to be the investigation of what it meant to live the good life. So they thought that was important, as Plato says, or has his character Socrates say, know thyself, know what it is for a being like you to flourish. And both Plato and Aristotle would agree on some really basic things. Plato starts off his book, The Politics, with the phrase, man is the rational animal. Both Plato and Aristotle think that acting rationally is sort of fulfilling our nature, our delos, as sort of organisms, rational organisms. So in that sense, they're both a kind of rationalist. Happiness is a life well lived. When we say hedonism in value theory, hedonism is a view that it's really just sort of pleasures that are really the only real foundation of value, pleasure and suffering. I think there's a lot of truth in that, but notice for the Greeks, for them, the idea is that they can accommodate higher values, higher aesthetic values much more easily than that, because the Greeks say, look, there is such a thing as living the good life for a human being, and that is the best. That's the most fun thing, if you want to put it in terms of fun, although they wouldn't tend to use that term. So you see that a simple value hedonism like Jeremy Bentham would have is reductive in that sense. Everything just comes down to some fairly coarse notion of pleasure, or a fairly leveling notion of pleasure as such, generic notion of pleasure. But when the Greeks say that real happiness is the satisfaction of fulfilling one's being, one's life, as the kind of creature one is, that leaves room for all sorts of pleasures and shades and fine grains of pleasures and higher and lower and so on. So that's a real advantage, I think, that they have. I think it's, in general, a red herring to argue that you can't talk about higher and lower values if you're talking about phenomenal experience, but I'm going to get to that in a moment. So just looking at a couple things, Plato's Symposium, really speaking fairly generally on the slide, I think. A metaphysical rationalist, what does that mean? That is to distinguish him from contemporary post-Kantian people who sort of tend to think that rationalism is some kind of mental property that isn't something that's found in the world. Plato thinks that the whole universe is sort of, that all the matter in the physical universe is kind of coming into and passing out of form in this kind of tidal sort of way, including human beings. And like everything else in Plato, like all other intelligible things in Plato, human beings can be more or less human beings until finally they're not human beings enough to be called human beings at all. And that's possible in his view, because there are degrees of reality for a material thing, the degree to which it conforms with its form. And so Plato thought that being logical and being beautiful were really basically the same thing. This is why all the muchachos in the Symposium, El Banquete en Español, think that Socrates is all desirable and want to get with Socrates. He's not pretty on the outside. He's short and homely and old and all that stuff. But he has a beautiful soul that everyone can appreciate when they talk to him, and that's why they find him so attractive. So that's the idea. Now a big thing in both this kind of, when I say metaphysical rationalists, again, the Greeks think that these formal mathematical properties are kind of woven into the fabric of the universe, including human beings. And this distinguishes them from this later early modern Kantian or Cartesian Kantian tradition that tends to say that the mind is kind of projecting these kinds of ideas or constructing these ideas. So then second bullet point. Now, there is some evidence that people actually do find human faces to be beautiful to some extent because they are symmetrical and balanced, and that could have to do with the face signaling good gene expression or something like that. And I'm sure that those kind of factors are all over the place. Well, that's consistent with Plato, because Plato says, what it's going to be is that we're going to find form to be beautiful. The ultimate beauty, of course, for Plato is sort of the beauty of mathematics. Mathematics is sort of considered in its entirety as kind of the most beautiful thing in the world. And everything else is beautiful by extension as it participates in that. Third bullet point, as I say, a drawback for this way of thinking is that, well, maybe not necessarily a drawback. I shouldn't say that. But the view here is that the material body on Plato, the view is that the material body is sort of the source of imperfection and corruption. It's the material body that's coming to be and passing away into and out of form. So the original sin is really just being incarnate, being physical, being material, because as a material being, you're imperfect. So that's the human dilemma, to be caught between the beasts and the angels. And indeed, that's where Christianity gets it from. The problem with Plato is that last bullet point there. He's so otherworldly. I mean, he believes that it's really transcending the desires of the body. As I say, very interesting and important parallels to a lot of Asian thinking on this. That really what we are mostly interested in when we think of aesthetics, which is sort of the phenomenal pleasure of the beautiful sunset or the beautiful or the delicious food or whatever it is that we're appreciating. And in a sense, Plato really isn't sort of interested in that at all. That is, he really thinks that the only thing that makes anything good is the degree to which it conforms to transcendental form. So that's the ultimate classical sort of definition of beauty, the classical Platonic definition of beauty. Now, Aristotle, always objecting to this mystical dualism of Plato, always trying to find this middle way between reductive materialism and Platonic dualism. And so Aristotle thinks that, as he says in his Poetics, and I'm sticking pretty closely to Aristotle's Poetics here on this slide, what Aristotle thinks is that in drama, particularly, we see people, characters in situations that we ourselves have not been in, situations of incredible stress, for example, or of incredible complications of one sort or another, emotional situations that ordinarily we don't experience. Think of seeing a depiction of people being in some kind of mortal combat, or a depiction of people having romantic heartbreak, or any of the familiar things that we often do see in the arts. And Aristotle's idea is that we have to, these help us sort of simulate being in these situations. As we think through being in that situation, then we confront how we would respond right now. And we can also ask ourselves, how ought we to respond? How would we like to respond if we were to find ourselves in a situation like that? So he sees this as character building. And as I say, the Greeks sort of see everything as character building. If you talk to them about what's good, what's either ethically good or beautiful, aesthetically good, they're going to tell you it's what's fulfilling sort of the good rational character of a person, which is not the sort of cheapened notion of catharsis that we use today. But last bullet point. So Plato's about the soul, the immortal transcendental soul. He's talking about what's beautiful to the pure rational soul, in as much as it is pure and rational. And what's beautiful to the soul, the pure rational soul, The soul is doing its sort of Pythagorean exercises of doing logic and geometry proofs and rising up out of the muck. Then for that kind of being, a immaterial, platonic, formal soul, then the most beautiful thing is going to be the perfection and symmetry and inevitability of mathematics taken in its entirety, I think, essentially. Whereas Aristotle, you talk about form, matter, and then the interaction between form and matter. The interesting thing about Aristotle, since he sees Democritus is interested in matter and Plato is interested in form, and Aristotle wants to find that middle way, that non-reductive materialism, functionalism. So Aristotle is concentrating on discipline. Aristotle gets this. It's formulaic for him. He says, yeah, the discipline is the most important thing. That's what you really need to work on. Not all this mystical communing with the form that Plato wants to do. Neither one of them, though, are particularly all that keen about the pleasures of the body. Again, you've got the soul, you've got the body, and you've got the discipline, the interaction between the soul and the body. And it's very much Plato to be interested in the soul, and it's very much Aristotle to be interested in the discipline. But neither one of them is particularly interested in talking about phenomenal pleasure as such. They're both kind of suspicious of that because, again, as virtue theorists, they both see life as a kind of eternal sort of struggle to rise up out of worldly imperfection. Well, empiricism. David Hume says reason is the slave of the passions, and that's sort of it. Think of Darwin, for example. So what happens is, well, biology happens and shit happens, and eventually you get these big monkeys that really like to eat chocolate. Is there any reason for that? Is that some plan of God or something? No, it's just the result of all these contingent biological processes. And so now we have this. So, let's carry on. I mean, it's a very English sort of view. Nietzsche said about this view, he said, man does not want to be happy. He said, only certain Englishmen want to be happy. And I thought that's one of the funniest things he ever said. But yeah, second bullet point, empiricists tend to be hedonists. Hedonists, not in the popular sense of some sort of satire, playboy mentality or something. Hedonist in the technical, philosophical sense, meaning that ultimately what value really is just simply good and bad qualitative experiences of embodied beings. And frankly, I think that's probably right. Again, non-cognitivists, just as empiricists like David Hume are non-cognitivists about ethics. What does that mean? Very simply, that they don't think that these are examples of rational thought. The Kantian, for example, the modern rationalist is going to think of value judgments as sort of logical exercises of some sort, or at least say that they ought to be sort of logical exercises of some sort. But Hume goes a little too far because Hume also is a rhetorician, and Hume is also trying to make a point in his essay on the standards of taste, which is an excellent essay, and I do recommend it. Though he does power home the idea that you don't really have particularly any reason why one person ought to like one thing and not another, and he claims that there is intense cultural relativism. Hume is, Hume makes mistakes on this point. He's a bit of an Enlightenment racist that way. So he overstates, I think, the degree to which we might find different cultures valuing different things and finding different things pleasant and unpleasant. Technically, the reason that he's doing that is he's trying to combat Cartesian arguments that that something when you sort of prove the logical necessity of a thing, and he doesn't think there are any Cartesian arguments for that, for example, in value judgments about aesthetics or about ethics. But I think, as I said, I think he goes a little bit too far on that. I see students get confused a lot because they think that somehow part of the point is that maybe you taste spaghetti sauce differently than the way that I taste spaghetti sauce. And so therefore we don't know how each other tastes spaghetti sauce. And this is some sort of philosophical problem. people really get stuck on that. Let me just try this here for a sec. Okay, so that ought to do it. So let's go back to the share the screen again. Right. Now, so as I was saying, you get this problem in sort of intro to philosophy class where people think that the point is, gee, I can't know that he tastes spaghetti sauce the same way that I do. Therefore, I have no idea what he means by saying that he likes spaghetti sauce. Therefore, there's no such thing as right and wrong, and nothing is true. And this is very far from true. He sort of gives that impression, but there's no reason why the empiricians, in fact, Hume's whole psychology is based on the idea that there are regularities of behavior, and that the only way you can say there's a personality or character at all, it could be known at all, is solely and wholly in virtue of the fact that there are these regularities of appearance and behavior in the person, such that they are a coherent person. So, the idea that, well, you have a different, you have different taste buds on your tongue than I have taste buds on my tongue, so therefore I have no idea whether spaghetti sauce tastes like to you, is a red herring. It's not what the point is really at all. Now he does argue that last bullet point, that humans tend to like things that seem useful and pleasant and healthy to them. And that's a notion that it's adaptive, that our value judgments are to some extent adaptive. And in the next century, the 1800s, the 19th century, Charles Darwin, John Stuart Mill are both working through that notion that one place where value is coming from is utility. Okay. All right. So Kant. Now, Kant, there are people who work really hard on trying to develop Kant's aesthetics, and Kant himself was really excited about the project of a Kantian aesthetics, a transcendental idealist aesthetics. I don't think it makes any sense at all. I'm going to tell you exactly why that is by first talking about Kant's ethics and working to his aesthetics. From that, we all know, most people know more about Kant's ethics than they do about Kant's aesthetics. The trick that Kant wants to make in his ethics, and I admire Kant's ethics, by the way, is he says, look, let's do ethics as rational beings, or qua rational beings, because we're all rational beings. So Kant's sort of enlightenment role is this idea that we can get sort of universal peace because rationality is universal. So even though we're divided in all these other ways, we can all be rational. How? Well, Kant says, we can universalize. We can use our rational minds. We can ask ourselves, could any other being, any other rational being in this situation do this? And that's how we teach kids, right? We say, look, don't leave your skateboard on the stairs. Everybody can't leave their skateboard on the stairs, right? The golden rule: do unto others as you would have them do unto you, and that's really essential Kant. But the problem with Kant's ethics, it seems to me, and this is a game that people play. You can always take any of these categorical imperatives. He thinks it's categorically imperative that if you universalize your maxim, then it really is what every rational being should do. But it seems like the reason why everybody can't leave their skateboard on the stairs, and the reason why it's not a good idea for a nation to be preparing for war, is because the bad things that might happen if you do those unsafe things are really bad phenomenal experiences. That's why you don't put your hand on the hot stove, because you don't want to suffer. You don't want to suffer as a physical being. And I think, and so now notice this, if you can run that when Kant is trying to make ethical imperatives, right? Think about aesthetic judgments. Oh, well, that's pretty. Oh, well, I don't like that. That's not pretty, and so on. Why on earth would you be making pronouncements like that? According to Kant, it has to be that you're saying all rational beings would find that to be true, that is a beautiful sight, this landscape that we're looking at. Um, well, okay, why is it? I mean, maybe let's even say that's true. That's fine with me. I mean, again, remember what I said the last slide. I have no objection to saying that there are sort of universal human aesthetic responses. I'm sure there are, just like any cognitive psychologist. Sure, there are. Of course, there are. But why is looking at the beautiful landscape beautiful? Because it's a good, phenomenal experience. It feels good to look at it. God tries to fancy that up, but I don't think you can. Oh, look, last bullet point. Either, as in Platonic and Kantian ethics, either number one, you're saying that qualitative experience, phenomenal experience, really isn't relevant to your aesthetics at all. In which case, as I pointed out, you're doing something or other, but you're talking about values, but it's very different from what we really ordinarily think about as aesthetics today. Or if not, and you're saying that, well, aesthetic judgments are legitimate if they have been universalized, well, again, why are you going to universalize that maxim? Because you think that looking at the beautiful garden really is beautiful. That is to say, you think it's a good, positive, qualitative experience. There's no possible other reason why you could think that. So my takeaway then is very critical of Kant. Notice, I think you can, in this case, in the case of aesthetics and value statements, and he insists that rationalist value statements are universalized statements, but it doesn't seem to me that the fact that you universalize the statement subtracts anything from the fact that really the reason why you universalize it is because of the quality of the phenomenal experiences. The very thing that the rationalist wants to say is not the case. So again, I would conclude at the end of that slide with Hume, reason is the slave of the passions. After all, I think there's a great deal to that. I don't need it to be that I have to say that I'm doing something good or making something beautiful or having a good experience. I don't need it to be that I fall into some master plan of some supreme being or something. Okay, it's okay if a lot of that has to do with just sort of contingencies of the way the world goes. Maybe God just set everything up to go on, becoming and passing away. Why not? Okay, but what about higher and lower pleasures? One of the best parts, by the way, of the Platonic ancient Greek discussion of all this, and also totally in Aristotle too, the Nicomachean Ethics is what I recommend on there, is this distinction between higher and lower. And the thing that distinguishes the early utilitarian Jeremy Bentham at the beginning of the 1800s from John Stuart Mill, his next generation successor, is that Bentham does try to be reductive, a sort of reductive hedonism, and say, let's just have a hedonic calculus. So if in helping the old lady gives you 2 and eating the chocolate bar gives you 2.5, then I guess you choose the chocolate bar, that kind of thing. And Mill recognized this was a problem and tries to talk about the higher and lower pleasures as well. Not just in his book Utilitarianism, but I do recommend his book On Liberty, which is a very good one. Well, after all, second bullet point, I mean, most people, don't we, after all, think that contrary to Jeremy Bentham, it seems like I do enjoy helping the elderly person cross the street. And I do enjoy eating the chocolate cheesecake. And I do enjoy standing up on top of the mountain on the camping trip before going to bed at night and appreciating the stars and the vastness of the universe. All 3 of those kinds of experiences, I think, are really good, but are good for me. But it doesn't seem, does it? At least not on first glance, that these could all just be all sort of boiled down to the same kind of thing. Like when Jeremy Bentham says poetry and pushpen, tiddlywinks are both just as good. But see, it doesn't follow. I mean, the naturalists or the empiricists, they're not exactly the same. The empiricist, right, has an epistemological position that knowledge comes from experience. The naturalist, that's kind of metaphysical position that everything is natural, whatever that means. But neither one of them has to accept the criticism that they're somehow reductive. Both of them have plenty of room for there to be higher and lower pleasures, fine-grained pleasures. Um, you know, if mysticism is real and naturalism is true, then I mean, that it works somehow. I don't know how. I'm not sure what I'm talking about right there. Anyway, the last bullet point, empiricism isn't a metaphysical position at all. So, they don't have to be phenomenologically reductive. And you can say that naturalism is physically reductive. Naturalism is going to say, no matter what, the explanation for your experience is something about your physical body and the way it's interacting with the relationship, with the environment. And that's some kind of, maybe that's reductive. I'm not sure it's wrong. But the empiricist isn't committed to any kind of conceptual structure like that. They just say, well, some experiences are good and some experiences are bad. Okay, what about Asian philosophy? Because Asian philosophy is interesting on this. We find this both in the Chinese Taoist and Confucian tradition and in the South Asian Hindu and Buddhist tradition. That ultimately, if we're talking about the cosmos and experience at the highest level, we're looking at a world where we don't really see any values, any polarities between good and bad. Interestingly, notice Kant didn't like that about the empiricist world. I would just leave here a little side column suggestion that empiricism is actually much closer to Asian philosophies in this sense than rationalism is, for the most part, usually. Now, it's a tricky thing talking about claiming that good and bad don't really exist. I don't say such things glibly to classrooms full of young people, for example. One of the reasons for putting it that way and talking like that is because metaphysically, the emphasis is on the oneness and the interconnectedness of things, and the idea that the universe is one big thing. And so you wouldn't be you if not for everything else being the way that it is. And the spiritual energy of that is sort of compassion for everything, like Spinoza. Realization of the interdependent unity helps free the mind from suffering being frustrated. And that symbol of Taoism, for example, the yin-yang symbol, is you have the oneness of primordial unity, a line appears, it starts to turn, and so the concept of the integer, the concept of the number itself, contains both the concept of unity and indivisibility. It's the one, the number, but it's the same concept that contains the concept of divisibility and multiplicity. So it's at the conception of number that we get the sort of bridge between the world of the one and the world of the many. Moving sort of to Hinduism. In Hinduism, of course, you have tantric practices, yoga practices, various kinds of disciplines. Good tantra really means, things like shame, disgust, nausea, these kinds of aversions and negative thoughts and feelings often are just the results of various, what you could call mental formations. They're not real. Think of a doctor or a nurse taking care of people. Think of someone in war, or just about anything, right? You've heard of tantra before, right? So someone with good tantra is someone who doesn't think that there's like germs all over the place. In a way, it's kind of good mental health, sort of, almost. And that's a sort of more practical picture of overcoming these bipolarities that some of them are created, these bipolarities between good and bad. Metaphysically, the question is, okay, physical objects have physical properties, physical actions have physical properties, locations and velocities and so on. Are there value properties, aesthetic and ethical properties that are not physical properties? That would be metaphysical problems. In addition to there being physical things, there are also value things. as basically an empiricist, my view is that the goodness and the badness are properties of experiences. And I would point out to you that your conscious experiences are not actually something that's in the world. Actually, what you're calling the world is basically what you know through your conscious experiences, in fact. Now, we can talk of some sort of external world beyond your conscious experiences, but that's not an experienced world. It's interesting to think about what that world is. To some extent, it's an artifactual world because, among other things, that's the world of history books, science books, right? Geology books, novels. Right? That's where we hear about the common world, but there's no one's experiencing the common world, right? So if aesthetics properties are properties of experiences, then they're not things that are in the common world, which means they're not a problem, for example, for science. That's my view. I believe that is a Buddhist view. I'm sure it's an empiricist view. All right, so two different kinds of value: pragmatic value and qualitative value. That is the pragmatic value that something has in terms of helping us stay alive and do other things that we need to do or want to do. And the conscious value that something, the phenomenal or qualitative value that something has as an experience. So that was a good experience. I enjoyed that experience, or I did not. Do those things come together? They most certainly do. Another place where Hume was just trying to show that we don't have logical proofs for the logical necessity of our prescriptive utterances, our ethical judgments, and our aesthetic judgments. But that didn't mean that we don't know anything. Hume thinks we know all kinds of stuff. It's just that the right account of knowing is not the account that Descartes gives us, that we have a logical proof of its necessity. He doesn't think we have a logical proof of the necessity of the sun coming up in the east, right? So, look, what really happens? Well, think of a single-celled organism. It's in the water somewhere. It's billions of years ago. Yeah. If it goes up, it reproduces. If it goes down, it doesn't. Some go up, some go down. There's something about the ones that went up that distinguishes them enough from the ones that go down over, as you all know the story, over many, many iterations, you start to get selection for traits. So what is it? I mean, well, it's something that made that organism a little more sensitive to its environment, maybe some sort of sensitivity to the sun, to light, or something like that. Biologists mostly think that actually sight has evolved a couple different times, because any perturbation on your surface that gives you light sensitivity is going to give you a little bit more sensitivity to interact with your environment. Now, again, the Cartesian thinks that you're this soul sort of sitting up out in outer space somewhere observing everything. And then from that point of view, why something should be good or bad is pretty weird. But what you really are is a body. What you really are is a body, and you've got millions and millions and millions of nerve endings all over your surface and inside of you too, as well as your sense organs. And you are then intensely involved with the stimulation coming from your environment and very responsive to it. Could there be a conscious artifact that became a legitimate recipient of a moral concern? There could. And would there be anything otherworldly about such a thing? No, only that, unlike any artifacts that we have today, and they're not computers, these won't be computers. That might be an intelligent artifact, but a conscious artifact would be an artifact that was so responsive to its environment that we became empathetic with its positive and negative responses, because they seemed to be so acute and so fine. Because that's all there is with us. We're not qualitatively different from other material things. We're quantitatively different. And, so our degree of reaction to the environment is very, very high. And so, and that's the basis of empathy. Look at those bad experiences, look at those good experiences. On this view, I think this is consistent with John Stuart Mill and Hume, for example. At some point, you get living beings who are so complex in their ability to respond to the environment, their sensitivity to the environment, that they become objects of moral concerns in as much as they motivate empathy. Why? By virtue of the depth of their responses. And as Wittgenstein says, you know it when you see it. All right, so is that it? Yeah, okay. Okay, so value theory in general and aesthetics, and other people would dispute this. It is my view that aesthetics and ethics are essentially the same thing. I think it all ultimately does come down to aesthetics, including the transcendental stuff that seems ineffable. But the world is a magical, mystical place. Again, the Cartesian's going to say, well, heaven's the magical, mystical place, not down here. So I disagree. So, all right. So a little bit about value and the foundations of value today. Okay. I'll see you next week.